Hello, everyone. I wanted to do an overview video for part three of the course, which I've entitled "Life After Death?" Question mark. Because, of course, it's a philosophy course. We're not presuming that there is or isn't life after death. We're exploring the different problems associated with death, and I would say that question of an afterlife is one of those problems. Um, by way of an apology, let me say I understand that I'm asking you to read a lot in a short period of time, especially in part three of the course where we have three long and demanding readings. We have part three of the course where we have two long and demanding readings from Plato and Landsberg. But this is an unavoidable problem with accelerated courses. You have to read a lot of stuff. You have to work harder. It's not spread out over 15 weeks. So that's just the way it is. Um, if we this section of the course, looking into this question and reading two authors who, in very different ways, argue for life after death, is of course a departure from what we've been doing so far. Um, I like to say, I like to put it in these terms. In the first two parts of the course, we work within an Epicurean space. That is the fundamental sort of limits of the discussion of these different aspects of death and mortality take they take place within a space that's established by Epicurus's basic idea of death, and that is that death is the becoming nothing of the human being. That death is the absolute and irrevocable end of the human person. Of course, the second and third readings in the first part of the course took issue with Epicurus, but not with that basic idea. They took it for granted that he was right about that, and they tried to argue with the implications of it for whether death was a bad thing for the one who dies. In part two, the more open-ended discussion, or the wider, more freewheeling discussion of mortality, Jonas and Gray both also take it for granted that death is the absolute end of the person, and they are interested in the implications of that for how we live, meaning of our mortality, in other words. It's only here in part three that we see authors trying to break out of that Epicurean space, and giving an entirely different theory of what death is, and a theory of what happens to us when we die. I have paired these two together, the Phaedo and Landsberg's experience of death, because they both argue that the proper way to understand death is as a transition to another form of being. However, it is quite important to see how they differ in their conception of that. The Phaedo is perhaps the most important document in Western philosophy having to do with the immortality of the soul. It is, well, it is a lot of things. It's a great literary masterpiece, is what it is. And it's a great philosophical dialogue. But what it fundamentally is, the most important thing about it, is that it is an argument, a series of arguments, and one might say one long argument for the immortality of the soul. Just as Epicurus starts somewhere with regard to death, so does Plato. Epicurus' starting point with regard to death is that death is the privation of all awareness. As we'll see, Socrates' starting point in Plato's dialogue is that death is the separation of soul and body. That is what he takes for granted about death. He doesn't try to prove that. But once he makes that claim, or once Socrates makes that claim, that death is the separation of soul and body, which is readily agreed to by his friends, it's obvious that he has to argue that the soul can continue to exist without the body. And if there is one essential question, and I think there is, to the Phaedo, that is it. After the separation of soul and body, can soul continue to exist independently of body? In a certain sense, that is the most important question that most of us have. Once we begin to think about it, once we begin to clear our minds of the things, that perhaps is the most important question. So the dialogue itself is to be judged in its success or failure on how well it argues that the soul can exist independently of the body. And it is not a religious dialogue. It is trying to answer that question in purely rational, purely reasonable way through argumentation. Which is not to say that Landsberg is not a philosopher who is trying to argue things. He certainly is a different sort of philosopher, and certainly is a Christian philosopher. You've got to read it. One of the things that you as a college student, someone who's reading things of sophistication, is to get over the labels. What I really mean is that just because somebody's a religious thinker, or just because somebody's a Christian thinker, or just because somebody is a Catholic thinker, you cannot presume that you know what they believe, because there's too much variety within all of those categories. There's no one way of thinking religiously. There is no one way of thinking in a Christian way, and there's no one way of thinking in a Catholic way. Again, you as a college-educated person know that. So you cannot presume that you know what Landsberg is getting at just because you know he's Christian, or just because you know he's got a Catholic point of view, because you don't know. You have to read it. And I say that as a matter of just advice, because I've had students in the past who really didn't read it and thought that they knew what he said because he's Catholic, and they were wrong. For instance, they'll say things like, oh, he relies too much on the Bible. He doesn't rely on the Bible at all. He may refer to the Bible here and there, but it's not an essential part of his argument. But what is his argument? Well, of course, his book is called, or his essay is called The Experience of Death. And insofar as he calls it the experience of death, he is directly confronting Epicurus, who we know said there cannot be an experience of death. But he's doing more than that, than saying that there is an experience of death. He is ultimately arguing, as we'll see, for the survival of the person through death. And yes, he's a Christian. Yes, he's a Catholic, and that cannot be ignored. But he's fundamentally arguing that death is not the end for the human person, and that we should not think of it that way. And he has his reasons for thinking it. It's a challenging essay. Another thing that I've seen people do over the years with Landsberg is to stop reading at a certain point. Don't do that. The argument or the reasons he gives for why we should believe in a life after death are really not given until section 5. He has a lot of really incredibly important and interesting stuff to say before that. But just as we might, I mean, if we're going to judge the success or failure of Plato's Phaedo and whether or not he gives us good reasons for believing that the soul can exist independent of the body, then we would judge the success or failure of Landsberg insofar as he gives us good reasons to believe that the human person has an existence beyond death. It's to let you know, in terms of an overview, it is an entirely different, another school. It is an entirely different project. It's an entirely different perspective in terms of what death is than we have been working with so far.